So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Joseph Jones. I am Associate Teaching Professor of Anthropology and Associate Director of the Institute for Historical Biology at the College of William and Mary. On behalf of the Institute and our founding director, Dr. Michael Blakey, we'd like to thank you all for being here and to offer special gratitude to the Afro-American Historical Association for hosting us this afternoon. This is the first of 6 public events that we are co-sponsoring with the Afro-American Historical Association, the Josephine Community School Community Museum, and the Shenandoah Valley Black Heritage Project. I want to make sure I got that title correctly. The Shenandoah Valley Black Heritage Project. We thank you again for joining us, and we have what we think will be a very engaging program scheduled for you today. We will be hearing from Dr. Blakey on his recently published volumes, 3 volumes on the blinding light of race. He has adapted the topic to the blinding light of white supremacy as context for, again, these 6 events that will take us through the very beginning of next year. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our team. Again, I'll first starting with our director, Dr. Michael Blakey. Okay, helping out Victoria Gum. And then seated here just in front of me, Maya Wilson. And some of you met Malachi Tripaldi. He is outside helping to direct any traffic to the room. All right. So we want to thank you once again to the Afro-American Historical Association for this wonderful setup. And we look forward to what we think will be a very informative and interactive, we hope, dialogue. And so just by way of introductions here, if we could very quickly go around just to see who all else is in the room, we'd appreciate that. Some of you are familiar faces, some not so familiar. So if we could perhaps start with Ms. White. Thank you all. And again, we welcome you to what we know will be a very enlightening and instructive event as we go forward in thinking about the interpretation of Cedar Creek and Belle Grove. And so just in terms of the background, just to give you a little bit of background, for the past several years, the Institute has been working with the National Park Service and our partnering organizations, including the Afro-American Historical Association, Josephine School, and the Shenandoah Valley Black Heritage Project. We've been working to increase and support specifically African-American descendant community engagement at the site. This, as many of you probably know, is part of a broader movement, a national movement to increase and to empower descendant voices at important historic sites like this. And so this kicks off what will be a series of programs that will include lectures, workshops, and other opportunities to gather feedback from descendant communities as we work to pull together. Ultimately, our purpose is to pull together a descendant voice so that they can inform research priorities and interpretation at Cedar Creek and Belle Grove. All right. Feedback?
No, speak a little bit louder. We don't want to hear you.
Okay. Is that yes? Okay, I can be louder. Okay. All right. Okay. So so with that, I would like to introduce our speaker for the afternoon. After which we will have time to discuss. Following this lecture by Dr. Blakey, we will have time to discuss both this lecture and this broader theme that we're bringing to you today, the theme of resistance, which we would like you to think about as an interpretive framework for the work going forward at Cedar Creek and Belle Grove. And so Dr. Blakey, Dr. Michael L. Blakey, received his bachelor's from Howard University and his master's and PhD from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He is National Endowment for the Humanities Professor of Anthropology, Africana Studies, and American Studies at William and Mary, where he is founding director of the Institute for Historical Biology. Blakey was scientific director of Howard University's African Burial Ground Project in New York City from 1992 to 2009. He is a member of the Scholarly Advisory Committee of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, Smithsonian Institution, from 2004 to the present, and was co-chair of the Commission for the Ethical Treatment of Human Remains of the American Anthropological Association from 2022 to 2024. He was president of the Association of Black Anthropologists, 1987 to 1989. He is the author of more than 80 articles in refereed journals. His 3-volume book, The Blinding Light of Race, Race and Racism in Western Science and Society, was released by Routledge Taylor Francis Press in 2026. He advises many descendant communities and has lectured on bioarchaeology, publicly engaged archaeology, and racism at universities and museums in Africa, Asia, Australia, Europe, South America, and across the United States. Okay, and without further ado, Dr. Michael Blakey.
Thank you, Dr. Jones, and welcome everyone. It's an honor to have been invited to talk as the kickoff of our 6 events planned over the next 12 months to help to inform and help in the assembly, the self-assembly of a descendant community, descendants of the enslaved, here in the Shenandoah region. So we at the Institute for Historical Biology at William & Mary feel it may be most useful to set the stage of our many planned discussions of African American resistance to slavery with our best understanding of the system of white supremacy they resisted. Thank you for this opportunity also to preview key points of my recently completed 1,200-page, 3-volume monograph on race and racism in science and society, from Aristotle to Trump. I hope you'll recognize it as an unfortunately epic story of the disguise white people created as a class of people. And often when I refer to white people, I'll be referring to them as a class of people established first in law and later in social relations. And it would also mean most white people, created to cover, to deny the immorality of their history of unjust taking. In the half-century I've worked as an anthropologist with training, research, and distinguished mentors in archaeology, biological anthropology, and cultural anthropology, I've always come to the conversation as a Black man, peering behind the veil, Du Bois would have said, the subaltern who speaks, the outsider within, according to Faye Harrison. There in the whiteness that defines so much of the anthropological perspective on our species world, I've found diligent people earnestly plying their trades to shed light on humankind. Yet white society, and the anthropologists among them, are often made obnoxiously blind, deaf, and numb by an adamant, if customary, simultaneous commitment to 2 ideas. 1, their moral innocence, and 2, their freedom to unilaterally take the fruits of others' labor. Racism is above all an ideology, a set of ideas created for the resolution of that contradiction which exists between white people's continuously unjust taking and their human desire to see themselves as worthy of trust and dignity, even admiration. In other words, to be good people who have nonetheless stolen, enslaved, raped, and plundered. It is the working out of this contradiction through racism and the religious ideologies preceding it that I want to discuss today. Watch carefully for the sleight of hand I describe, the transitions from one form of apology or moral justifications for the status quo to another in the course of Western history. From religious to scientific ideologies, from racialism to other forms of biological determinism, from anti-affirmative action to feckless diversity regimes, and now opposition to teaching truthful Black history in which white people are exposed. White people will repeatedly find ways to evade responsibility for their past and present immorality in their own terms. My careful reading of human evolution shows that all people require justice as a basic human need. What we call justice is the same as the generalized reciprocity on which our food-sharing ancestors depended for their sociality when we were foraging bands that defined our species' social evolution for 200,000 years. There had been no inequalities then, no oppressors, no racism, no wars. The first evidence of social inequality and war emerged with agriculture 12,000 years ago. Then human beings would have to justify their greed against the reciprocity, the equivalent of the golden rule, to which they had long been inclined. Greed and inequity demonstrate the broad range of possible behavior, however, in the same customarily egalitarian species. Indeed, humanity's hallmark is our flexibility and learned ability to change. Greedy behavior, obviously within our range, was aberrant, requiring an excuse, a justification to exist among those who had learned to love justice for 95% of their evolution. Some ancient religions began with that mission, making gods of kings and the new elite into God's servants who could deserve more than the masses. As an example of such religious excuses for untenable inequity, the 15th century Portuguese Catholics believed they offered Christian charity by converting the Africans they began to enslave. The same charity would be offered to the indigenous peoples of the Americas in the centuries to come as moral cover for what others knew to be immoral slavery and European colonial land theft. White occupiers convinced themselves they had done no wrong. Northwestern European Protestants would continue the idea that the other, dark and non-Christian beings, were without souls and in need of saving through conversion. Yet, in doing so, they denied them human rights over their lands and bodies. The truth, however, is that Black and Native people never needed white people for anything. Quite the contrary. In time, biological race and racism will replace these religious ideas in order to justify unjustifiable treatment of those who white Americans convinced themselves were not real human beings. They were property, they argued, not those who deserved the Christian golden rule. Such fallacious justifications will seep into science. Natural philosophy is what they called it in the 18th century, to contaminate our way of knowing. Let us begin at the present and circle back around to the past. All lives matter, or diversity regimes, are comparable ploys. These programs project the moral righteousness of their advocates without rectifying more than a fraction of white privilege at the colleges, universities, and businesses where these performative programs are rooted. All lives matter and diversity regimes actually constitute the ploy of misdirection away from the specific need to address anti-Blackness and white supremacy towards something we already know. Diversity is good. But what about addressing white people's racism? White people's singular responsibility for the injustices of American racism is deliberately clouded by the notion that racism is a basic human quality for which no particular group need be singled out. The perspectives of such programs are rooted in the specific proposition that our societal problems of race derive from natural bias, like xenophobia, fear of the unknown, for which we are all red, black, white, yellow, brown, equally inclined. I point to a recent Smithsonian exhibition called Bias Inside Us, in which racism is attributed to the brain's amygdala, where fear responses take psychophysiological form. Thus, the problem of racism and its solution is omnidirectional, in which all share equal responsibility. It is as natural as fear, they say. But that is not true. The idea that racism, like prejudices toward every other size and shape of human social and biological variation, is just one of the unfortunate biases people naturally have, misdirects from the problem of white supremacy. White supremacy is an ideology and systematic social structure that was conveniently innovated step by step to cover over the immorality, in their own terms, of white people's exclusive and inhumane taking. White people and their capitalist class still hold the unfair advantages of material resources and power derived of their long, ideologically covered taking. Allow me to begin by dismantling the fundamental assumption being proffered that all bias has the same basis and is thus interchangeable with white supremacy. The idea is that the operations of the amygdala in human psychophysiological responses to fear cause one to lash out against those least familiar, and that this xenophobia is what causes the racism one sees in America. I wrote a dissertation on human social psychophysiology, and it is a complex and fascinating topic. But we will have time only for a couple of examples of racism and non-racism, one historical, the other experimental, which defy the assumption that a natural fear of the unknown is its basis. The first recorded contacts between the English and native peoples of the Chesapeake and Carolinas were not marked by racist fear. I refer to the 1650 chronicle of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Norwood, who on what is today the eastern shore of Virginia, en route to Jamestown. A powerful story. Both his Maroon Party and the Indians who saved them were, with one British exception, mutually respectful. An Englishman, Major Stevens, whom Norwood said they recognized as a kind of idiot, would distrust the Algonquins unreasonably, and the other Englishmen shut him down. Norwood, consistent with the language of the earlier Roanoke encounter, regarded the Indians as those who followed, quote, the golden rule. They were familiar as human beings, but as English soldiers and settlers increasingly and violently violated that rule in Virginia and Massachusetts, robbing, murdering, raping, violating their own agreements, and desecrating cemeteries, Native people learned not to trust them by virtue of their deeds. For the British, what was formerly idiocy would become the norm. Undoubtedly, endocrine and neurotransmitter responses of the amygdala, hypothalamus, pituitary, and other glands were affected by those changes. They were caused by the social changes they were meant to respond to, not to create. People are stressed by what they experience. With convenient laws, the English would other the Powhatan as savages, as they had done regarding the Irish they colonized earlier. The term comes from the their references to the Irish as savages. They legally defined Africans as property, and by 1691, transformed their self-definition of Christian, which is how they were all referring to themselves, those from Europe, from Christian to that of white people. So for the first time, we see in law the term white people referring to a group of people. Now they took with a sense of moral righteousness. Was Thomas Jefferson, a century into this exclusive white humanity, not familiar with the human characteristics of the hundreds of people he presumed to own at Monticello, right down to their genitalia? He had 4 children with Sally Hemings. In fact, it was the presence of the full human capacities of African workers which made their enslaved labor so valuable to white people, especially if they could be paid nothing for it. A final example of the inconsistency between racism and a lack of familiarity is of the 2 modern experiments with Black preschool-aged children. The first was conducted by psychologists Kenneth and Mamie Clark for the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case in 1954 that began the end of legalized segregation. The other, by Kerry Davis in 2007, is reported in a film called A Girl Like Me. You can find it online. It's a powerful film, 16 minutes, I think. In both experiments, one sees 3 to 7-year-old Black children, in most, but not all cases, pointing to a white doll as the good doll, and the Black doll as the bad doll, while resentfully admitting to the fact that the Black doll looked like them. They, 3 out of 4, had learned to hate that with which they were most familiar, themselves. This self-hating internalization of white supremacy shows that learning is essential to the basic cognitive logic of familiarity and affiliation Robert Zadok showed decades ago. These children had learned to hate that with which they were most familiar. We learn in our homes, neighborhoods, classrooms, movie theaters, social media, and video games through language and constructed images, the symboling ape. This example also shows white supremacy as working in one direction: institutionalized, interpersonal, and internalized, against dark people, even little dark people, and aggrandizing whites. Now that is my point. Let us go back further in time to examine the beginnings of the ideas that would lead to the notion of white supremacy. Paleoanthropologists and paleopathologists like Philip Walker have shown no evidence of war prior to agriculture 10 to 12,000 years ago, as I've said. Such populational antagonism was recently learned, that's recent in anthropological terms at least, and is not empirically demonstrated an innate habit for us as food-sharing hominids, as human ancestors, for millions of years. The temporary enslavement of war captives, labor, was a major benefit of war when it emerged, creating stratified society with a godly elite on top and the enslaved at the bottom. In such newly ranked societies like ancient Greece, some argued slavery was unjust and a blemish on Greek society. Aristotle disagreed and philosophically enabled the massive enslavement of others by Alexander the Great. Using cherry-picked and insubstantial premises in his politics, Aristotle argues that slavery is just if it is natural, and what is natural, and slavery is what is, and so on and so forth. Albert Einstein does an excellent job of describing Aristotle essentially as an intelligent man who was nonetheless blinded by his prejudice. The inequity of slavery continued to be justified by religious ideology as Muslims succeeded the Roman Empire. North Africans, the Amazigan, we call them Berbers, and Syrians created a tolerant Iberian civilization of what would become Spain and Portugal. This is the Alhambra that they left to the Spanish. The 13th century descendants of the Visigoths in Spain, now Christianized and longing for the power they had lost to the Moors 6 centuries before, wanted to take back the land and all the civilization Muslims had built upon it. But they would not retain the intercultural and interfaith tolerance that marked the greater brilliance of Al-Andalus in Granada, Cordoba, and Toledo. The Reconquista and the Spanish Inquisition was to take, and take they did, from the mid-13th to the end of the 15th centuries. But they did so in the name of a moral idea, Christian charity. First meant to give and share according to its own stories. So the Spanish and Portuguese conceived to give in order to take, and the reverse. The Portuguese and Spanish enslaved under the moralizing guise that to enslave was to Christianize, as I mentioned earlier. So said Gomez Zurara, to dry his tears when Zurara imagined that the wretched and crying African men, women, and children strewn along the makeshift beachfront markets in Lisbon might also be of the shared blood of Adam, said theologist Willie Jennings. They also messaged the notion of spiritual whiteness to fill the void in Christian election from which they had alienated themselves by purging the chosen people, Iberia's Jews. Jews and Muslims could only remain in Spain as conversos, converted to Christianity, and forever impugned, suspect, and untrustworthy. Having severed Judeo-Christianity at its hyphen, Iberia's Christians would elevate the complexions of Europeans as that of the saints and deities, then to appear in Renaissance art. Christian justifications would continue among the Protestants in Virginia and Massachusetts, but this obviously generated a similar range of contradictions as had occurred among conversos in Iberia during the Inquisition. At the beginning of the 18th century in Boston, Cotton Mather, the son of a president of Harvard University and a preacher, would attempt to Christianize enslaved Africans as what a good Christian should do. This against the better judgment of slaveholders who preferred Africans to be taken and used without guilt as soulless chattel. In the end, Mather was forced to free his enslaved servant, Onesimus, who made the contradiction between property and Christian family membership palpable simply by being and knowing what he was. Mather didn't understand the contradiction. The enslaved man understood it acutely. What he was a man. He was referred to as froward, uncooperative. He would not play Mather's comfortable game of Christian slaveholding. Perhaps he was the original angry black man. Stuck in his own contradictions, Mather had to free him, partly. He was still required to chop firewood for Mather's family every year. And in Boston, that's no small matter. By the end of the 18th century, those like the African preacher John Jay in New York were claiming their conversion to Christianity as justification for their manumission. Jay, or Gia, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, would shrewdly claim that he could read the Bible and only the Bible by virtue of a miracle. With that ploy, he would slip through the impediments of white society that both forbade him to read and required it as a demonstration of conversion. Following the end of the transatlantic slave trade in 1807, the massive conversion of new Negroes would demonstrate by way of the abolitionist movement that they were worthy of Christian empathy, so popularly used by Harriet Beecher Stowe in Uncle Tom's Cabin, the most popular book beside the Bible in those days. Key as well was the exposure of white people's brutal immorality in the abolitionist ethnographies, to borrow a term from Savannah Shangay, slave narratives, of Equiano, Jay, Jacobs, Northrop, McCune Smith, and Frederick Douglass, and others. The opening of spaces where freed Blacks could live allowed them to write their own human story against the dehumanizing omissions and distortion of Black people's history by white people. Science would be called upon to resolve the contradiction between morality and dehumanization once most enslaved Africans were Christian. They had to find another way. The current making of white people into a natural rather than religious standard of real, normal human beings had begun with Linnaeus's opportunistic and Eurocentric new biological taxonomy of race. Here, racism begins and supplements Christian chauvinism. It was their European Enlightenment in which secular reason and democratic ideals were paired with the dehumanization of people of color. Now, racism resolved Thomas Jefferson's dilemma between the morally right answer, all men are created equal, all people are created equal, and the facts on the ground, Africans were enslaved, by making Blacks out to be non-men. Carolus Linnaeus' first scientific descriptions of racial biological groups were no more than stereotypes, biased in favor of whatever white people wished to do with them, painted onto nature. Next came Blumenbach's social and natural positioning, positioning of his Caucasian race at the elevated Adamic center and norm of the human universe at the turn of the 19th century. These, he believed, were the uniquely standard people from which other races had degenerated. Yet his monogenism, which Stephen Gould called softline racism, was as close as European science came to acknowledging human equality then. Blumenbach was an abolitionist. Yet, like the liberal gloss over the racist assumptions of many white people today, it was not close enough. The hardline racism of the American school of polygenesis, which considered white people to be the only members of the human species, did not make monogenism into anti-racism then any more than all lives matter, something we already know constitutes anti-racism now. Frederick Douglass would intellectually dismantle Types of Mankind, the most broadly disseminated tome of polygenism in 1854, its year of publication, and this is a print from that book. In his Claims of the Negro, ethnologically considered, Douglass demonstrates that this science to be meant to make the Negro out to be, other than his words, a man. a person or human being. Who they obviously were. The scientists he lists were among the first in a long list up to the present day who asserted first that head measurements showed racial differences in intelligence, and later that IQ measurements did the same. Both were repeatedly proven false. In fact, craniometry went on for 100 years, and yet it had no more to do with what or how a person thought than shoe size. It's the same relationship. But these apologetic ideas that human inequality is not inequity, but is instead natural, continues as a pervasive biodeterministic imagination. Douglas would be the first American to argue that it was one's circumstances that molded even human biology, not the reverse. He would later be joined in his nature-nurture debate by Du Bois in Atlanta, Haiti's Antonin Firmin, and 20th century Black and Jewish scholars. He attributes this early biological determinism to white people's convenience. Quote, "Pride and selfishness combined with mental power never want for a theory to justify them. And when men oppress their fellow men, the oppressor ever finds in the character of the oppressed a full justification for his oppression. The evils most fostered by slavery and oppression are precisely those which slaveholders and oppressors would transfer from their system to the inherent character of their victims. Thus, the very crimes of slavery became slavery's best defense. By making the enslaved a character fit only for slavery, they excuse themselves for refusing to make the slave a free man." And he argues that white scientists' notion of their neutrality was farcical. He dismisses the European Enlightenment's greatest conceit, saying, quote, "The neutral scholar is an ignoble man," end quote. Such scientists, he said, simply sought to gain favor from all sides for their partisan views. The enslaved had grown the tobacco and sugar cane for sugar and rum, the drug trade on which the Western economy was founded. Consumers came like flies to honey. Then African Americans picked the cotton on recently stolen lands in the Deep South that launched the Industrial Revolution, says Joseph Inikori. As chattel, Dana Rainey Berry so substantially shows, Black bodies were bought, sold, and rapaciously used without legal repercussions and only equivocal moral consequences. Many of these people had been marched through the Shenandoah, where 1 in 7 of its population were enslaved, according to Broomfield. The ideological shift toward scientific apology and its justifying slavery with racism, and its 19th century debate joined the repeated drone of rebellions, small and large, undertaken by the enslaved that began to characterize that peculiar institution as a kind of national Russian roulette. Gabriel's and Nat Turner's rebellions in Virginia sent shockwaves throughout the United States. Northerners were saddled with returning Black persons who had escaped there. Along with these factors, the new capitalist economy that slavery had made possible and profitable evolved. It strained against a near feudal slavery. Together, these elements tore the fabric of North American slavery, soon to rend southward into Latin America. The winning of the Civil War and the modest majority vote for the 14th Amendment that ended slavery were followed by a mere 12-year Reconstruction. Radical Reconstructionists who wanted Blacks' equality failed to prevail over Southern and Midwestern landscapes emblazoned with white riots against the rapid material and social effects of African Americans' dedicated work of political and economic uplift. They did not like it. W.E.B. Du Bois described the attitude that ended the Reconstruction best, I think, when he said, quote, "Unfortunately, there was one thing that the white South feared more than Negro dishonesty, ignorance, and incompetency, and that was Negro honesty, knowledge, and efficiency," end quote. African American integrated legislatures rebuilt infrastructure and began public schools in the South. The early end of the Reconstruction withdrew federal protection for Black citizens in the South and eliminated Black legislators for 100 years. At that time, Jim Crow had come. Jim Crow apartheid in different degrees throughout the nation for that century. Social Darwinism and its eugenical application would replace the static craniometry of the 19th century with the same goal: to demonstrate that white supremacy and privileged entitlements were natural. They justified racial segregation with the same racist theories that would bring about the Holocaust in Germany. Same authors, same theory. The first half of the 20th century saw the first round of the politics of resentment. May be applied currently, certainly since the 80s, but began then. White people, convinced that only they were deserving and Black people were not, decided to destroy the evidence of Black excellence, like Tulsa, Oklahoma, or the Red Scare, multiple Black communities being burned down because they succeeded, and what they believed falsely should have been theirs. Tenancy and industrial incarceration of Black men created slavery by another name, says Douglas Blackman. Then the African American people were strategically divided between three choices. One, leaving the country whose economy they had built for a deaf white majority, Marcus Garvey. Staying and striving for shared equality, W.E.B. Du Bois was the leader of that idea. Or three, accommodating white supremacy with the idea that their time would need to come a little later, Booker T. Washington. Masses of Southern Blacks left the Bookerite training schools of the South for what Wilkerson called the warmth of other suns. These were acts of resistance. As Maya Angelou has called the Great Migration a migration of refugees. Some of us have come back once it's a little safer. This white supremacist scientific narrative with ample laboratories, expanding collections of bodies of the objectified other at museums, curricula, authoritative books, and enthusiastic scientific American presidents served to justify immigration restriction, racial apartheid, and anti-miscegenation laws in the US prior to the rise of the Nazis. The post-World War II anti-racist social science and historiography, often led by Black and Jewish scholars, emphasized racism and class structures as causing American inequity. And this too was resistance. The civil rights movement and the urban riots that were ultimately required to implement its demands brought about a moment of national white reflection, as the Kerner Commission's riot report in 1968 determined that Black people were not crazy. The riots were a response to white people's problem, racism. White people, as such, generally resisted the idea that they, like everyone else, shared a deep, often unpleasant, historical subjectivity of their own. Most white people, including their scientific community, resisted making both the social and epistemic turn to accept their equal subjectivity to that of others and acknowledge their wrongs. It is to say, they had come to believe they were really the only real, complete human being in the room, objective, universal, standard, which is to say, superior, without saying it. Instead, the civil rights movement, after the civil rights movement, they restored Blumenbach's old idea of the Caucasian, the racial term he invented at the turn of the 19th century, to represent the uniquely standard, unmarked, universal, Adamic person, often without specifying it as a race. As the only real human being, hard-working American in the room. White people no longer need to talk about racial supremacy. After all, such racism had been recently sanctioned against, after the war, against Nazis, and most white people would choose to distance themselves from them. With the civil rights movement, anti-racism would achieve the moral high ground. Interestingly, they would need to take that high ground while simultaneously protecting their racial privilege. In that effort, liberals would become anti-racial as though it was anti-racist, which it was not. Let's take a little explanation. Thus, the 1980s was a time of white backlash and misdirection. White people turned to seeking their special privilege using newly sanctioned anti-racist terms. What white people generally did, however, was to deny recognition of the existence of racism or of race itself, as if a solution to racism, which it was not. To see evil, see no evil, hear no evil, and speak no evil. They undermined progressive affirmative action by characterizing it as non-democratic and placing it in opposition to a coveted meritocracy that, given the terms of structural racism, had never existed in America for anyone but landed whites, if that. They opposed such corrective measures by mythologizing the existence of a racially level playing field, as though white racism had magically disappeared with desegregation policies. This myth then provided justification for a notion of reverse racism as constituting any corrective measure that explicitly recognized the need for race-specific correctives to balance race-specific inequity. The mention of race must be racism, they would say. Thus, white people ostensibly stood on the high ground of anti-racism to oppose correctives for racial discrimination as though the correctives were racist, thus to preserve their privilege. Meanwhile, they resegregated housing, neighborhoods, their school districts, and more by virtue of real estate agencies and banks rather than strict legal codes. Then redlining and home lending and the many other structural means by which whiteness siphons disproportionate wealth furthered racial discrimination. Anyone who identified the practice of racism might be accused of playing the race card and dismissed. Meanwhile, by experimental means, with nearly 700 test cases between 1991, the Urban Institute study by Turner et al., and 2009, Pager's study, white people were shown to discriminate against Black and brown job applicants, entry-level job applicants in Milwaukee, Chicago, Washington, and New York City. Equally meriting white applicants were statistically shown to receive 2 to 3 times the jobs they merited in competition with carefully matched Black and brown entry-level job applicants. Black people therefore received no more than one-half the jobs they merited. And that evidence does not represent the real differences due to the theft of inheritance from enslaved laborers or the further siphoning of capital into white families ever since. What else has afforded African Americans no more than 7% the per capita wealth of neurologically comparable white people in 2007? In fact, they had reached 10% by 2005, and then they began to lose their homes under those speculative mortgages that were, unfairly appropriated to Black people for their homes. In the 21st century, these studies show that siphoning was done with a smile, with no outward show of racial hostility, thus without evidence of episodic individual malice or individual intent, says legal scholar Haney Lopez. The courts will give such conveniently defined discrimination a pass. Murray and Herrnstein's The Bell Curve in 1994 stands out as a bestseller of scientific racism in the mid-1990s. They never used the term race. They concluded that the social and economic inequalities of American society resulted from genetic differences in IQ, never observed in genes. There are no genes for intelligence. They've never been observed. Folks have looked for them for a long time and continue to say, we'll find them, they're just around the corner, but they've been just around the corner for 100 years. They don't exist. But there's a deep biodeterministic imagination, and that becomes a default intuition for Americans. Maybe it's in their genes. These genes differentiated between the criminal mind, the new pseudonym for Black and brown people, from the cognitive elite, who were the best-selling book's enthusiastic white readers. Affirmative action and Head Start programs were attacked as useless at that time. The contract with America that was simultaneously being pushed through Congress reduced investments in education. Education is apparently not the problem if it's in their genes, and fostered the expansion of private prisons. The word criminal became a new non-racial, racist term for Black and brown people. The fact, potential beneficiaries of affirmative action came to represent an aspersion representing presumably undeserving non-white people as thieves stealing from deserving and self-righteous whites. Affirmative action as unworthiness, in essence, became a new N-word. In the current Trump era, the summary term for undeserving is DEI. DEI. Yet white women who quickly escaped the aspersive connotations have been the main beneficiaries of affirmative action since the 1960s. Ironically, many came to identify with their white families and communities opposing affirmative action for the stereotyped Blacks and browns of their white imaginations. In 2004, the Supreme Court essentially redefined affirmative action as permitting greater social and intellectual diversity, rather than the original intent of correcting generational inequity due to racial and gender discrimination. Justice O'Connor notoriously asserted that racial discrimination had nearly ended without evidence. It is well documented that affirmative action programs were so undermined by legal uncertainty as to whether specific races can or cannot benefit above others for corrective balance, that the advances made by Black and brown students entering into STEM fields began to decline after that ruling. the Supreme Court recently added to that uncertainty. Universities took up more race-neutral efforts for diversity, engaging performative diversity talk, with which I began my discussion. Today, the Trump administration, as I've said, opposing DEI, stirs disgruntled white people to dismiss even that much. These examples of what I call equivocation span from the Obama era, when a post-racial society was pretended, into the Trump era when, perhaps fearful of Obama's honesty, knowledge, and efficiency, white people elected a thuggish savior to restore white people to their former imagined greatness, along with the return of their riots from Charlottesville to the Capitol building to Minnesota. And now we are hearing the almost unbelievable screams of Robin DiAngelo's white fragility, that is, the defensive, victim-blaming, reflexive behavior white people use to silence the very mention of evidence of racism around them. In this context, Black men are readily accused of being angry. But the real question of white people is, why are you not? The answer is that they have hidden their harms, as the Kerner Commission report attested, behind lies of omission. A mass white movement today openly insists we cannot teach African-American history and the recent manifestations of racism to American children, because white people, persons, are made uncomfortable by it. The problem is that Black people's history carries with it discovery of the moral deficiencies of white people. One cannot tell our valiant story, as the National Museum of African American History and Culture does, without describing the brutal, white-imposed no way out of which our way was made. Today, I need tell no one in this room about how Youngkin's anti-critical race theory campaign in Virginia, or DeSantis's Stop Woke Act, actually the Stop Truth, or as one colleague called it, the Stop Reparations Act in Florida, is trying to turn white people's fear of discovery into a justification for denying Black children a history. Weaponizing white fragility and trumped up fears into as deadly a force in the classroom as the stand your ground law makes on the streets where Trayvon Martin once lived. It's the same vacuous justification. I feel threatened. I feel guilty. And today, direct opposition to Black equity is being waged around our right to a truthful history, a history of Black cultural creativity and labor that built the economy of the Western world and which continues to influence the culture, morality, and politics of the modern one. Yet the traumas of our American experience with which we continue to contend must also be exposed if they are to be repaired. As a man once said in John Gwaltney's Ethnography of Black Life, if you don't know when you've been spit on, it doesn't too much matter what else you think you know. Albert Einstein was correct in 1946 when he wrote that white people who disavowed their moral responsibility for slavery and racial inequity by blaming them on faults of Black people simply wanted to keep what they had stolen. He called this narrative a fatal misconception. The fact is that those defined as white people, especially the wealthiest beneficiaries of the extraction of surplus value, the measure of exploitation and profit, owe Black people $42 trillion for the inherited wealth they stole, according to a recent panel of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. There are many estimates. They all need to be evaluated, examined, and politicians should make a deal. Money does not disappear when the persons who made it die. We all know that. Money, it was siphoned to white people's family inheritance. And as the United Nations resolution stated exactly a month ago today, it is time for them to pay it back. I noticed that that resolution did not get into the major press. The Guardian covered it. None of my nightly news has mentioned it. The UN has determined that the transatlantic slave trade was the greatest abuse of human rights in human history, looking at everything. And it didn't get in the press. Reparation is not vengeance, as many white people mischaracterize it. Black people have never sought vengeance. The record is clear. We have always sought justice. And human beings, the food-sharing ape, are not satisfied without it. Finally, I end with what those old enslaved people said in the language of metaphor, the same language the Yoruba consider most appropriate for an adult's speech. There's an Uncle Remus tale about Massa's son meeting the tar baby on a road. Massa's child wanted to pass through the blackness that stood between him and the clear road to where he wanted to go. Thinking he had the right to dismiss it, little Massa told the tar baby to step out of his way. No response. He screamed at the tar baby. No response. He hit it and kicked the tar baby only to get stuck in the ooze. Every time he chose arrogantly to dismiss the tar baby, he became increasingly stuck. Tangled web indeed. The message of the story, the old enslaved people told, is that the only way to get past the tar baby is to step out into the briar patch. The briar patch, thorns and all, is the truth. The truth, they say, will set you free. Thank you.